I transferred to Braxton College in the fall, a small liberal arts school nestled in the heart of the Midwest. The campus was picturesque, full of old brick buildings and towering oak trees that turned fiery red and orange in autumn. It was exactly the kind of place where I thought I could start fresh, away from the chaotic city life I was leaving behind. My dorm, a historic building called Marshall Hall, was one of the oldest on campus, steeped in tradition and, as I would soon discover, something much darker. I moved into room 213, a small but cozy space on the second floor. My roommate Jake had already been there a week. He was a laid-back guy, always with a smile, and we hit it off immediately. But there was something about the room that unsettled me from the start, a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe, a sense of being watched that I couldn't shake. The first night, I dismissed it as nerves, the kind you get when you're in a new place. But as the days turned into weeks, the feeling grew stronger. I began to notice strange things. The temperature in the room would drop suddenly, even when the heater was on full blast. My belongings would be out of place, as if someone had been rifling through them. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, sure that I'd heard whispers, soft but insistent, coming from the walls. Jake didn't seem to notice any of it. When I mentioned the cold or the whispers, he'd just laugh it off, telling me I was letting the old building get to me. "These walls have seen a lot," he'd say with a wink. "You just have to get used to the quirks." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something that wasn't just in my head. One night, after a particularly grueling day of classes, I came back to the room to find Jake out. The room felt colder than ever, and a strange sense of dread settled over me as I entered. I tried to distract myself with some reading, but my eyes kept drifting to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to grow darker, denser. I was just about to turn off the light and try to sleep when I saw it. A figure, barely discernible in the shadows, standing in the far corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to see in the dim light. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs and eyes that glowed faintly like embers in the dark. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. I blinked, hoping that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there, unmoving, unblinking. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at it, but eventually the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving me trembling and soaked in cold sweat. The next morning I confronted Jake, desperate for some kind of explanation, but he just shrugged it off. "It's an old building," he said. "Your mind plays tricks on you." But I knew what I had seen. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a product of my imagination. Something was in that room with us, something dark and malevolent. I couldn't stand it any longer. I needed answers. I began researching the history of Marshall Hall, determined to find out what was happening. It didn't take long to uncover the grim truth. Years ago, a student named Peter had taken his own life in room 213, overwhelmed by the pressures of school and life. His death was a dark stain on the college's history, one that was rarely spoken of. Rumor had it that his spirit never left the room, that he was still trapped there, tormented by the same demons that had driven him to his tragic end. The more I read, the more the pieces fell into place, the whispers, the cold, the shadowy figure. Peter's ghost was still there, and he was trying to make contact. Armed with this knowledge, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and let this spirit torment me, or worse, drive me to the same fate as Peter. One night I waited until Jake was out, then lit a candle and stood in the center of the room. The air was heavy, charged with an almost electric tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I know what happened to you, and I'm sorry, but you don't belong here anymore. You need to move on." The temperature plummeted, and I felt a cold wind whip through the room, snuffing out the candle and plunging me into darkness. The shadows in the corner began to move, coalescing into that same tall, gaunt figure. But this time, I didn't freeze. I stood my ground, staring into those glowing eyes, refusing to be afraid. "You don't belong here," I repeated, louder this time. "You need to find peace. Leave this place." For a moment, the figure didn't move, didn't react. Then, slowly, it began to fade, the glowing eyes dimming until they were just faint pinpricks in the darkness. The room grew warmer, the air lighter, and then the figure was gone. Completely. The strange occurrences stopped after that night. The whispers ceased, the cold spots vanished, and I was finally able to sleep soundly. But every now and then when the wind howls outside and the shadows grow long, I can't help but wonder, did I really help Peter find peace? Or is he still there, just out of sight, watching and waiting? I'm not one to scare easily. As a second-year student at a large state university, I've always prided myself on my rationality, my ability to keep a cool head under pressure. But lately, something's been gnawing at me, a sense of unease that I just couldn't shake. It all started a few weeks ago. I was walking back from the library late one night, after cramming for midterms. The campus was mostly deserted, a few stragglers here and there, but otherwise eerily quiet. That's when I first felt it, the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my nerves, a result of too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But the feeling persisted. Every time I was out late, I felt that same unsettling presence, a vague sense of being followed. I'd catch glimpses of a figure out of the corner of my eye, a tall, shadowy silhouette, lurking just on the edge of my vision. I tried to ignore it, rationalizing that it was all in my head. I was stressed, overworked. My mind was just playing tricks on me. But the incidents kept happening, and they were getting harder to dismiss. It wasn't just at night anymore. I'd be sitting in class or eating lunch in the cafeteria, and I'd suddenly feel that familiar chill, like cold fingers trailing down my spine. I'd glance up and see that figure again, always distant, always just out of focus, but undeniably there. I started getting paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, checking the shadows for movement. It was messing with my head, making it hard to concentrate on anything. I wasn't sleeping well, and my grades were slipping. I could tell my friends were starting to notice, but I didn't say anything. How could I? I didn't even know if it was real. Then came the night that changed everything. I was leaving the library again, later than usual. The campus was deserted, and a thick fog had rolled in, shrouding everything in a damp, heavy mist. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to my dorm. That's when I saw him again. He was standing under a street lamp across the quad, his face hidden in shadow, just watching me. My heart began to race. I tried to keep calm, telling myself to just keep walking, to not let him see that I was scared. But I couldn't help it. I looked back, and that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, matching my pace. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. The footsteps stopped too, a second later. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I forced myself to move, slowly at first, then faster. The footsteps resumed, growing louder, closer. Panic surged through me. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy, relentless. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. I darted down a side street, hoping to lose him in the maze of narrow alleys. But he was right behind me, his presence a dark, oppressive force that seemed to close in around me. I was running out of breath, out of options. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I couldn't stop. I glanced around, desperate for a way out, and that's when I saw it. A light ahead, a faint glow through the fog. It was the back entrance to a 24-hour diner, a place I'd passed by countless times before. I bolted for it, my last hope. I slammed through the door, the warm light and clatter of the diner flooding over me like a lifeline. I turned, half expecting to see him burst in after me, but the alley was empty. He was gone, vanished into the night like he'd never been there. I collapsed into a booth, trembling, my mind racing. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and an old man nursing a coffee in the corner. The waitress gave me a concerned look, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. What could I say? That I was being chased by a ghost, a phantom. Eventually I managed to calm down enough to tell the owner what had happened. He listened, nodding slowly, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. He said he'd call the police, but his tone was dismissive, like he was humoring a crazy person. And maybe I was crazy. Maybe it was all in my head. The police came, took my statement, and promised to look into it. But I could tell they didn't think it was anything serious, just another stressed-out student cracking under the pressure. And maybe they were right. But deep down, I knew what I felt, what I saw. I left the diner that night, but the fear never left me. It stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I never saw the figure again, but I could feel him, always there, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. And that was the worst part, not knowing if he was real or if he was just a figment of my own unraveling mind. But whether he was real or not didn't matter anymore, because the fear was real, and it was enough to make me question everything. I couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. And that's what drove me to the brink, that constant nagging doubt, that sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake. I never told anyone else about that night, not in detail. What could I say? That I was being haunted by a shadow, that something had followed me out of the darkness and into my mind. No one would believe me, and I didn't blame them. I could barely believe it myself. But every time I walk across campus at night, every time I feel that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, I know he's still there, waiting. I remember the first time I saw Rachel. It was the start of the fall semester, and the sun was setting over the sprawling university campus. The sky was a gradient of orange and pink, the kind of sky that made you feel like anything was possible. I was unpacking my bags in the dorm, half listening to the excited chatter in the hallway, when Jessica walked in with her new roommate. Jessica, with her bright smile and infectious energy, had always been a magnetic presence. We were friends, maybe not best friends, but close enough to share late-night coffee runs and gripe sessions about professors. But Rachel was different. She was quiet, almost too quiet, as if she was trying to fade into the background. Her eyes rarely met mine, and when they did, there was something unsettling about them, something I couldn't quite place. At first I chalked it up to nerves. New semester, new faces. Maybe she just needed time to adjust. But as the weeks passed, I noticed things about Rachel that I couldn't ignore. She was always scribbling in that journal of hers, a worn leather-bound book that she guarded like it held the secrets of the universe. Jessica tried to engage her, to bring her out of her shell, But Rachel would just give these vague, cryptic answers that left us more confused than before. Then there were the nights. I'd stay up late sometimes, working on assignments or just procrastinating online, and I'd hear something strange from their room. It wasn't loud, just a faint scratching, like someone writing furiously, punctuated by the occasional low murmur. It sent shivers down my spine, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. One night, I stayed over at Jessica's dorm after a particularly grueling study session. Jessica had fallen asleep almost instantly, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. I lay there in the dark, listening to the soft rustling of the trees outside, trying to calm my racing mind. And then I heard it. The scratching. I opened my eyes and saw Rachel, sitting at her desk, her face illuminated by the dim light of a single desk lamp. Her hand moved furiously across the pages of her journal, her lips moving silently, as if she were chanting some dark incantation. I wanted to say something, to ask her what she was doing, but something in her expression stopped me. Her eyes were wide, frantic, darting back and forth, as if she were seeing something I couldn't. A cold dread settled in my stomach, and I turned away, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping that sleep would take me. The next day, Jessica mentioned that Rachel hadn't come back after I left. She shrugged it off, saying Rachel was probably at the library or out with friends. But I knew better. Rachel didn't have friends. She barely spoke to anyone, let alone socialized. I didn't want to worry Jessica, so I kept my thoughts to myself, but the knot of unease in my gut tightened with each passing hour. When Rachel still hadn't returned by the following morning, Jessica began to worry. We checked the library, the cafeteria, every quiet corner of the campus where Rachel might have gone to be alone, but she was nowhere to be found. Jessica was frantic, her usual confidence shattered by the growing fear that something terrible had happened. I tried to stay calm for her sake, but deep down, I knew that this wasn't just a case of a student needing some space. It was on the third day that Jessica found Rachel's journal. I was there when she did, standing in the doorway of their room, my heart pounding in my chest. Jessica picked up the journal with trembling hands, her eyes wide with fear. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it, flipping through the pages with a mix of dread and curiosity. The journal was filled with incoherent ramblings, pages upon pages of disjointed thoughts and feverish scribbles. Rachel had written about nightmares, dark, twisted dreams that haunted her nights and seeped into her waking hours. She spoke of a shadowy figure, a presence that seemed to follow her wherever she went, watching her, waiting. The last entry was the most disturbing of all. Rachel had written about a final dream, one where the shadow had taken form, reaching out to her with long skeletal fingers. The words trailed off abruptly, the page ending with a jagged tear, as if Rachel had ripped it out in a fit of panic. We took the journal to the police, but it didn't help. They searched the campus, interviewed students, but no one had seen Rachel. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Jessica was beside herself with guilt, convinced that she should have done more, that she should have seen the signs. But what signs? Rachel was a mystery, an enigma that no one could solve. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no trace of Rachel. Jessica tried to move on, but I knew the uncertainty was eating her alive. I tried to be there for her, but the truth was, I was just as haunted as she was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had touched our lives, something that had taken Rachel away and left us with nothing but questions. Sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees outside my window, I think I hear that faint scratching again. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that the shadows are just shadows. But deep down, I know better. The scariest monsters are the ones that hide in plain sight, lurking in the corners of our minds, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I'm terrified that one day it will come for me too.